One example is a story they tell. You know, you have to wait 10 years there for delivery after you order an automobile. And so a fella had finally gotten the money together and was going to buy an automobile. Only about 1 out of 7 families have them in that country. And he went through all the paperwork and everything and finally signed the last paper, laid down his money, and then the man behind the counter said, come back in 10 years and get your automobile. And the man said, morning or afternoon? And wait. The fellow behind the counter said, well, what difference does it make 10 years from now? And he said, well, a plumber's coming in the morning. They came to General Secretary Gorbachev, and they told him there was a woman in the Kremlin. She wouldn't leave unless she could see him. So he said, well, bring her in. And they brought her in. And he said, old mother, what is it? What? She said, I have a question. He said, all right. She said, was communism invented by a politician or a scientist? Well, he said, a politician. She said, that explains it. A scientist would have tried it on mice first. I know that some of you are no beginners when it comes to writing headlines. Reminds me a little bit of a cub reporter. You knew that something would remind me of a story. A cub reporter whose first solo assignment was interviewing a fellow who was just going to have a birthday that made him the oldest person in town. And he got to the address. It was an older building out in the outskirts of the city, and elderly gentleman ushered him in. He sat down, and the reporter determined he was the man, and he said he was there for the interview, and he led right to the matter about how old are you, and the man said 96. He said, to what do you attribute your longevity? And the fellow said, I don't smoke, drink, or run around with wild women. And at that moment, there was a crash from upstairs, and the reporter looked up, and he said, what was that? The old boy said, oh, that's Dad. He's drunk again.
You know, there was a time that being a Republican in this area of the country felt a little bit like being Gary Cooper in High Noon, outnumbered in a big way. I remember the story of the fella here a while ago who was running for Congress as a Republican. He stopped by a farm to do some campaigning, and when the farmer heard he was a Republican, his jaw dropped, and he said, wait right here. He said, while I get Ma. She's never seen a Republican before. So he got Ma, and the candidate looked around for a podium to give his speech from. The only thing he could find was a pile of that stuff that Bess Truman took 35 years trying to get Harry to call fertilizer. So he got up on the mound, and when they came back, he gave his speech. End of it, the farmer says, that's the first time I've ever heard a Republican speech. The candidate said, that's the first time I've ever given a Republican speech from a Democratic platform.
I was visiting Ireland and my father's ancestors' background and community and so forth, and then found myself on Cashel Rock, where St. Patrick erected the first cross. And the young Irish guide was taking us through the old ancient cemetery, and we came to one tombstone, and he proudly pointed out, and the tombstone was inscribed, remember me as you pass by, for as you are, so once was I. But as I am, you too will be, so be content to follow me. And this had proven too much for some Irish who had scratched on the stone underneath, to follow you, I am content. I wish I knew which way you went. You know, when I think of the welfare system, it reminds me of a story, and I know some here have heard me tell this before, and maybe everybody knows it, but pretend that you haven't heard it because I like to tell the story. It's a story about the parent with the 2 children and 2 sons, and one of them was a dyed-in-the-wool pessimist, and the other one was an incurable optimist. And they thought they were both so unrealistic that they talked to a psychiatrist about it, and he said he thought he could solve the problem. And they said, well, what? Well, he said, let's get the most magnificent set of toys any boy ever had, and we'll put him in a room. We'll take the pessimist there, and then we'll turn him loose, and when he sees those toys and knows they're all for him, he'll get over being a pessimist. Well, he said, what are you going to do about the optimist? Well, he said, I have a friend who's got a racing stable, and he said we can get quite a quantity of what they clean out of the stable. And we'll put that in another room, and when the optimist has seen his brother get those toys, and then he gets that, he'll get over being an optimist. Well, they did it. Finally, after a period, they then went in and followed in where the boy was with the toys, and he was sitting there crying. And they said, what are you crying about? He said, well, I know somebody's going to come and take these away from me. And they went down to the room with the optimist, and he was on that top of that pile of stuff, and he was throwing it over his shoulder as fast as he could. And they said, what are you doing? He says, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere.